you. So hi everyone, welcome to the 5th of our live virtual events that we're providing for you this year. If you don't know who I am, I can hear myself. If you don't know who I am, I'm Lucy Tomlinson, Resident Experience Manager at Barchester Healthcare. Hi from Strachan House, great. I'm working with a team of people to bring these live events to you for your enjoyment as part of your activities and entertainment programme here at Barchester. I hope you're all really, really well, and I can see that we've got a number of you joining today. In fact, I think we've got sort of 94 people watching on Zoom there, which is great. And we've got about 8 people watching on YouTube. So hi to everybody that is joining us today. So let's get into a few of the housekeeping elements. Hi from Rivermead. Then I can see that many of you are already typing into the chat, which is great. So lovely to see you. So housekeeping elements. First of all, this is a Zoom meeting. It means all of your accounts are muted, so there won't be any disruption for our presenters today. However, some of your cameras are on, so we can see you. And if we can just make sure that we are muted, there's a couple of people on this side there. Let me just, there we go. Just so we don't want to hear any background noise. As it's a Zoom meeting, if you haven't already, please change your name to use your home name. And then we would like you all to say hi, which many of you are doing. Hi, Windmill Manor. Thirdly, we will have a question and answer session at the end of this talk. So any prepared questions, great. We will be asking them, but we will also be asking some questions throughout this talk as well. And then finally, fire alarms. So if you have any fire alarms go off unusually, sort that out first, keep everybody safe and follow your normal protocols. Hello from Woodland View and Orchard House. Great to have you here. Hello from Crabwell Hall. So that leaves me very excitedly to introduce our special guest, who is the lovely Peter Nurick at V&A Dundee. Hi Peter, how's it going?
Hi Lucy, not too bad. Greetings from sunny Dundee.
Excellent, nice to know that it's sunny there. That's good. Is it cold?
It is, it's deceptively sunny.
Yeah, it's pretending to be nice and warm, but we know really. Peter, it's lovely to have you here and learn more about V&A Dundee, the construction of the museum, a little bit more about the city itself. And I know from having a look at these slides with you yesterday, this is a fantastic talk for anybody interested in the city itself, but also if you're into design, architecture, construction, it's fascinating. So thank you so much, firstly, for being here. And secondly, how is the V&A Dundee and how is the museum going with all the COVID restrictions?
Well, we're in a really exciting position because we're in the lead up to reopening on the 1st of May. It's been quite a strange few years with opening for the first time in September 2018, having to then close in early 2020, reopen in August 2020, and then close again in December. And here we are preparing to reopen for the 3rd time in as many years. So although it's a lot of work, I feel we're getting quite used to it now.
Yeah, I can imagine, but very excited, I imagine as well that you're
very exciting. We can't wait to have our museum back.
Oh, good. Well, we are excited to hear more about the museum itself and the construction behind it. And guys, I think you're in for a treat here with the story behind everything. So Peter, feel free to share your slides and we will get into the content of the actual talk today.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Lucy, for that introduction. And again, greetings to everyone, wherever you are, all across the UK from Dundee. My name's Peter. I've been part of the team at V&A Dundee for nearly 6 years now. And I think it's important to start by, first of all, saying welcome to Dundee. We're hopefully going to be taking you to the sunny city on the banks of the Tay today. For those of you who don't know Dundee, we're a city, quite a small city, of about 148,000 people on Scotland's northeast coast, approximately 1 hour's drive north of Edinburgh and about an hour's south of Aberdeen, a similar size to York or Gloucester. Also, very important accolade, we're also the sunniest city in Scotland. So a day like today, we're definitely living up to its name.
That's a lovely picture, a lovely view.
And I am currently, just to give you an idea, if I can turn on my little laser pointer, I'm not sure if you can see my house, but I live just up here on the top right edge of the city there.
So you're seeing fields beyond you. You're not really seeing.
Yeah, just right on the edge of the city, so I can see fields one way and then look back into the city on the other. So it's a really nice place to live. So if we go a little bit closer, Dundee is located on the banks of the River Tay, the Silvery Tay, which is actually the longest river in Scotland and the largest river by volume in the whole of the UK. And it's this connection with the river that we're going to kind of explore a little bit in more detail. If we start by going back and setting the scene a little bit, Dundee is a city developed around its connection to the river. And during the Industrial Revolution, its port was critical in developing Dundee into Juteopolis, which was the jute capital of the world. This photograph from about 1935 shows the docks in the city centre that were built out into the shallow river estuary. We can look a little bit closer still on the next slide. And V&A Dundee is now located roughly where this warehouse is. If you look very closely, it actually has R. Bachelor's Potato Merchants. So we have very inauspicious beginnings in Dundee. What you can also see in this photograph is one of Dundee's major civic buildings, the Caird Hall, which we house graduation ceremonies and musical performances and concerts. But also right in the middle, you've got the historic ship HMS Unicorn, which is the oldest British-built floating warship anywhere in the world, and currently is actually moored a little further along to the east in one of the few surviving docks on Dundee's post-industrial waterfront. So there's a lot of stuff in quite a small area.
Yeah, and I can see that there's an archway which we're going to hear about as well. So it's good to see the before.
So that's a very well spotted, Lucy. You might be able to make out a structure, a sort of dark 3-arched structure, just towards the top middle of the photograph. And this is really the beginnings of Dundee's connections with Victoria and Albert, or V&A, we should say. That's because many years ago, in 1844, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert visited Dundee. They arrived from the river via a boat, and they entered the city under this wooden triumphal arch that had been built in their honour. I think I'm just going to... Somebody's ringing something. I'm not sure if that's my actually. I think. Hold on a second. Apologies.
There's somebody else ringing on the TV. I'm not entirely sure what that is myself.
I'm just going to pause it just for a split second. Oh, I think they've stopped. I think it was somebody phoning me actually. So apologies about that, everyone. So we'll jump back into the presentation, and I was talking about this triumphal arch that had been built on Dundee's waterfront in 1844 to celebrate Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's arrival into the city. Yeah. It was a really special occasion because this was actually the first time a British monarch had visited the city since the 17th century. So it was a very special occasion. The arch was actually built by a local carpenter. But it was just a temporary structure. However, people loved the archway so much that after Queen Victoria and Prince Albert left, a design competition was held to replace it with a more permanent structure. And it was won by a gentleman called John Thomas Rockhead, who had also designed the Wallace Monument near Stirling. His design was much larger, much grander, about 80 feet across, and cost somewhere between about £2,500 to £3,000, which back then, which was over £300,000 in today's money. So although this structure is very different to V&A Dundee, which we'll obviously be talking about in a minute, both structures, the historic archway built to commemorate Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's arrival, and the museum, both formed this dramatic archway, this gateway, a connection between the land and the sea. Incidentally, the archway was rebuilt very temporarily as part of Dundee Design Festival in 2016, a large public art project transformed it, or built it out of cardboard boxes. And this was torn down. Again, I'm just hear a phone ringing.
It sounds to me like Zoom trying to contact something within.
So what I'm just going to, difficult to see.
Never happened before, everyone. I don't know how they're trying to contact you. If that's something to do with a Zoom connection or a Skype connection potentially on your PC.
We'll keep going, and hopefully, if it is somebody trying to phone me, they'll get the message.
Yeah, not right now, please.
Exactly. I've put it on my calendar. They should know. Anyway, this was actually the third archway that was built after the wooden arch, the stone arch, and then a cardboard box arch. This one was torn down. It was just a temporary structure built as an art project. But sadly, the real arch was also demolished. It stood on Dundee's waterfront for about 120 years until it was demolished in March 1964 to make way for the Tay Road Bridge. And this, I'll admit, sadly set the tone of what was to follow.
Well, so this is the archway that was built for wood for Victoria and Albert to come in on.
So this was the stone structure built to replace that. The timber structure built to celebrate their arrival was just a temporary structure, but people seemed to like it so much they built the stone one, much grander one.
That was torn down in the 70s or 60s.
Yeah, 1964. So this is the archway in the process of being demolished. And there were quite a bit of mixed feelings about it because a lot of people thought it was a very grand civic structure. It was ornate, it was detailed, and it looked quite impressive. But at the same time, a lot of people didn't really like it. It was covered in soot and pigeon droppings. It didn't really serve a purpose anymore, and it was taking up valuable space on the waterfront. So, like it or not, in the name of progress, the archway had to go. And this, as I did, set the tone a little bit of what was to follow. This photograph shows Dundee Central Waterfront in the early 1970s. So quite big changes since those historic photographs of the docks. As Dundee's industry declined, all those docks, or the vast majority of those docks, were filled in. Roads, railways, and lots of mismatched buildings really cut the city centre off from the river. And you can see that a little bit better in the next photograph. This was Dundee in the mid-1990s, which is probably when I first visited the city as a child to go swimming at the Olympia Leisure Centre, this building here. This building was on the site of V&A Dundee before, so this building was also demolished to make way for the museum. Interestingly, in this photograph, you can also see Dundee's second historic ship down on the bottom left of the photograph, the historic RRS Discovery. She was built in 1900 and she took Scott and Shackleton to Antarctica before coming back to Dundee and is now berthed right next to the museum itself. So this really is the landscape into which V&A Dundee arose. Currently, Dundee is undergoing a transformation, a 30-year transformation of its waterfront. 8 kilometres of the city's waterfront, making it one of the largest urban regeneration projects in the UK. And this just shows some of that transformation in progress. However, we can't really talk about V&A Dundee without mentioning the V&A itself. So this is a photograph of the original V&A in South Kensington. Have you visited, Lucy?
I've been to visit a couple of times. A nice roast dinner in the cafe there. That was great. I want everybody in who can access the chat right now. Let me know if any of your residents have visited, and I will read out who has. I'd be intrigued to know. And if anybody's visited V&A Dundee as well, let me know that as well. But yeah, no, it's grand.
We'd love to see if you visited or not. But this is the original V&A in South Kensington in London. And people often ask why the V&A chose Dundee. In reality, it was actually the other way around. It was Dundee that chose the V&A. This was because in 2007, at a dinner hosted by the University of Dundee, a conversation was had about opening a new museum in Dundee in partnership with the V&A in London. The V&A is widely recognised as one of the world's greatest museums of art and design. It's got a collection of approximately 2.3 million objects in its collections that spans thousands of years of human creativity from all around the world.
We've got
It was founded.
Sorry, Peter, just jumping in. Chacon Park, most residents watching have been to V&A London, which is great.
Oh, lovely.
Vivian, yes, a few of ours have been many years ago. And to V&A Dundee, this is, and some have been to V&A London. I think those two homes were all South homes as well. Carolyn, tell me where you're from, but our resident Jean went to Dundee High School. Maybe that's Sutton Grange, maybe. Oh, it's Sutton Grange. Well, we know they're the closest, aren't they? Is it Sutton Grange that's the closest to V&A Dundee?
South Grange in Monifieth is the closest to us. And I'll mention them again later.
Yeah. So a few of our residents have been, so that's great.
That's fantastic. And again, we hope there'll be many more to visit in the future. So the V&A itself was founded in 1852, and it moved to its current home on Exhibition Road in South Kensington in 1857. So it's over 150 years old, 150 years before V&A Dundee was even talked about. Despite the sheer size of the V&A, amazingly, the majority of its collection is actually in storage. And as a result, they wanted to make more of it accessible to the public. Yeah. They also realized that a lot of the objects in storage were linked to Scotland or Scottish design. So about 12,000 objects they found. So these are, again, the reasons that they started having conversations about opening a new museum, a partnership with the V&A in Dundee. So this early idea, this partnership began, and we brought on other organisations to bring V&A Dundee to life, including Dundee City Council, Scottish Enterprise, and the two fantastic universities in the city, Dundee University and the University of Abertay. V&A Dundee would be the centrepiece of the city's redeveloping waterfront. And as a result, it needed to be something quite special, an architectural competition, a bit like the competition that was held for the original Victoria Arch, actually. An architectural competition was held to decide what the building was actually going to look like. It returned over 140 entries from architectural practices all over the world, and then 6 were shortlisted and put on display to the public at the University of Abertay Library in 2010. And I can actually show you the 6 shortlisted designs. It's a bit of a blast from the past because we don't really show these anymore. But the first one was this one at the top, this sort of mesh angular structure by Stephen Hall. We also had DeLugan Meisel Architects, which was this sort of UFO-shaped building that looked like it crash landed on the banks of the river.
Yeah.
We then had this very subtle one by Snohetta, a Scandinavian practice, which is actually entirely floating. It was going to generate its power by a tidal lagoon, and the entire museum would rise and fall with the tides. We had a Scottish practice represented. This is this one by Sutherland Hussey Architects based in Edinburgh. And then we had an American practice called Rex Architects, which was affectionately nicknamed the Bluebell because of its sort of shape and its angular blue glazing. And last but by no means least, we had this design submitted by the Japanese architect Kengo Kuma. Okay. And we can see all 6 designs here, all shortlisted designs here. And it'd be really interesting. Well, first of all, Lucy, which is your favourite?
I really like the top left. I like that it looks like glass and it looks really like reflective and kind of like the sea. So I would like top left, but I'm interested to know what our residents and our staff think. What out of these? So guys, there's a bit of interaction here. If you're able to let us know which of the numbers do you think would have been best for V&A Dundee based on the maps that we've just seen and the location, and also what do you prefer yourself? So either 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 or 6. And just pop that in the chat for me. We've got Vector House liking 3. So that's the floating version.
That's the floating one, yeah, by Snohetta.
Yeah, I love that. Ruth has also gone for 1. We might like the style and the glass and the water. Ford Mill have gone for 6. Esme 2. Let me know if any of your residents are voting for these. We've got a couple of 3, 5, and 4 from Chacon, so individuals. We like 3. 3's coming up quite popular, you know. 6 from Orchard House. Windermere liked 1 as well. 6. Carolyn, I think, was Crabwell 6, but we like older buildings. Flower Down 1, St Valens 3. Do you know 1, 3, and 6 seem to be the most
1,
popular?
3, and 6. Now that's really interesting because actually number 4, which was the only Scottish entry in the shortlisted 6, was actually the public's least favourite design. People felt it looks a bit like a boxy power station.
Well,
so yeah,
it looks familiar to me. I think it looks like a museum I've seen before. I don't know, the Tate maybe?
I think the top of it looks a bit like the light box at the top of the Tate Modern on London South Bank. So yeah, but I think what's really interesting is you can see that this is the job of an architect, to interpret the brief, interpret what we needed from a museum. And every single one of these 6 designs looks very, very different, but it was all designed to do exactly the same job.
Yeah.
So for those of you who said you really like number 3, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I did really like that design. Didn't vote for it, but I did really like it as an idea. The winning design that was selected by an expert panel and by members of the public was actually number 6. And this was the design by Japanese architect Kengo Kuma. So this is a photograph of the architect Kengo Kuma striking a suitably nonchalant pose in this photograph. He was born in Japan in 1954, and he founded his practice, Kengo Kuma Associates, in 1990. I'll just show you a few of some of his buildings because they really are quite astonishing. On the left of the screen, you can see a building he designed in 2011 called the Yushuhara Wooden Bridge Museum. And 5 years later, on the right of the screen, there's Asakusa Culture Tourist Information Center. Both of these, you can see lots of wood, lots of natural materials, which is something that he uses a lot in his designs. This is another museum, believe it or not. It's actually a dentistry museum. You might be able to make out what looks like a large ceramic tooth in the bottom, in the bottom left. But this again is another small museum built in 2010, and it's inspired by a traditional Japanese wooden toy called chidori, which is a toy that uses interlocking bits of wood that doesn't require glue or nails. So Kuma, the architect, is really interested in using traditional crafts and Japanese heritage. But he has designed larger buildings as well. This is a more recent one. This is 2019, the Odunparzi Modern Museum in Turkey. And very recently, we've got his largest building, which is the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Stadium. This obviously would have been front and center of the Tokyo Olympics last year, but as we all know, the Olympics have had to be postponed. So I believe they're actually starting this year on Friday, the 23rd of July. So Kengo Kuma's huge Olympic stadium will be featured on Olympics and the television screens around the world.
Yeah.
But what we'll do is we'll jump back to Dundee, back to V&A Dundee's story, because Kengo Kuma visited Scotland, and this on the screen is his very first sketch of a concept that would evolve into the museum itself. What's also really exciting is V&A Dundee is Kengo Kuma's first building in the whole of the UK. So he's done quite a lot of buildings in Japan, there's quite a few buildings across Europe, but until now hasn't done any buildings in Britain. So we're the first.
Excellent. Well done. And yeah, that I guess a shock to his culture when he came over and
I think so, but he also talks about the similarities between Japan and Scotland. There's a lot of similarities in terms of climate and geography, so we'll see that in some of his influences actually. A lot of people think the museum looks a bit like a ship, certainly with its large triangular forms jutting into the river, but in actual fact the original inspiration came from Scottish geology and the cliffs on Scotland's northeast coast. These are the cliffs up around Orkney, up at the very northern tip of Scotland. You might be able to see the horizontal geological layers and this idea of where land meets the sea. Kengo Kuma, I think, described V&A Dundee as arising from a long conversation between earth and water. So when we see the finished building, look out for angles, overhangs, and even caves. This is another cliff that inspired him. It's just a little bit further up the coast from Dundee at Arbroath. And again, you might be able to make out the horizontal geological layers in the cliff that look a little bit similar to the walls of the museum. You can see a better comparison here. So what we'll do now is we'll jump in and actually have a quick look at the design and the construction process. I should say I trained as an architect many years ago, so this is what gets me really excited. But Lucy, you'll keep me right if I start getting too technical.
I think it's fascinating, though, from his original sketch there to what was created and designed, and the use of materials and the inspiration. I mean, I don't have a brain of an architect at all, and it's just fascinating to think that was the initial to where they got to in the end, and everything that was put into it.
I think you're right. The process of design is absolutely extraordinary. The competition, the architectural competition, was held in 2010, and we didn't start construction until March 2015. So, yeah, nearly 5 years it took just the design process for a project like this. It's a long process, but we had to get it right. Yeah. This is an architectural drawing of the museum, and it shows quite clearly how the museum sits right on the banks of the river. The River Tay is at the bottom here, and part of the building juts out into the water itself. The building also sits in these 4 reflecting pools, which I'll show you a little bit later on. You might be able to make out RRS Discovery, the historic ship, next door as well. One of the first things we had to do before any construction started was put up protective hoardings all around the site. Now, normally on building sites, these can look a little bit ugly, but because we're a design museum and we want to do things a little bit differently, we actually turned these hoardings into what we believed was the largest comic strip in Europe, about 140 meters long. And the idea of the design on these hoardings was to tell the story of the museum and some of the objects that visitors could expect to see inside it. This is a photograph of the very first day of construction, the groundbreaking ceremony, as it's often called. So this was March 2015. So there we go, 6 years ago, a little bit, just over 6 years ago today. In the photograph, as well as the traditional Scottish bagpiper, you might be able to make out our first director, Philip Long. We've also got Fiona Hislop, who's the culture secretary. And at this side, we've got the architect himself, Kengo Kuma. Needless to say, these ceremonial spades were quickly replaced with something a little bit more industrial. We'd have been still digging if we just had these 5 spades to work with.
Yeah, it's a great picture before it all kicks off.
But it really did kick off, and it didn't take long for the site to start looking much, much busier. So this was only a few months later. The cranes were going up, the diggers were in position, foundations were being laid, and the site was a hive of activity. We rarely actually got to go onto the construction site because of obviously all the health and safety, but any chance we did, we took, and we had to go into the site huts and make sure we've got our hard hats on, our high-vis vests, and our steel toe-cap boots, and it was always a really special experience to go on and see our new building rising out of the ground. One of the first things they had to do was drill huge foundations because the building's really close to the River Tay. It sits on 198 pile foundations that are drilled 11 meters into the ground. Essentially, this is the same length. If you took the pile foundations out and laid them end to end, it'd be about 1.4 miles of foundations. That's the same length as the Tay Road Bridge. So this was one of the first things that had to be done before we could start building up. We had to build down. Mm. We also had to construct the part of the museum that sticks out into the river. And to do this, we needed to build what's called a cofferdam, a temporary structure to hold the river back. This dam extended about 42 meters into the river and used nearly 7,000 cubic meters of stone. That weighed about 12,500 tons. Most interestingly, this entire structure, this temporary dam, had to be completed in 3 months, so we didn't disrupt the harbour seal breeding season in the Tay, because the Tay estuary is a protected nature reserve, and we had to make sure that whatever construction we did, we didn't have any environmental impact at all. The museum itself, it's constructed out of reinforced concrete from a local quarry outside Monifieth. So this is my first little shout out to our closest Barchester home, South Grange. So they might know that the quarry about half a mile from their front door is where the concrete came to build V&A Dundee. The concrete is held in place by massive pieces of timber, basically big timber molds called formwork. It looks a bit like a giant concrete sandwich, in fact. You've got the molds, which is the bread, and then you've got the concrete in the middle, which is the filling. So there was huge amounts of formwork to produce. We had to create enough molds to cover 11,343 square meters. That's the equivalent of 2 football pitches worth of formwork. So a massive amount of work to do to create these walls. This photograph also shows you the extreme angle that some of these walls are leaning out at.
Yeah.
In total, there are nearly 1,000 pieces of formwork, each one different shapes, different sizes, that fitted a particular part of the building. If you look carefully, you can see some of the steel reinforcement. It's sticking out of that sandwich. It looks a little bit like hair or wire, but this is actually really thick, chunky formwork, reinforcement, and it allows the concrete to twist at these quite incredible angles.
I think you've got a picture of that twist coming up, right?
I do, yes.
Really?
You really had to sort of see it to believe it, actually, to make this building out of reinforced concrete. It's pretty impressive. Structurally, the museum's built around these massive central cores. These were the first things people could see rising out of the ground. And then the external walls are held back, a bit like arms holding out, reaching out from a torso, holding onto these external walls that lean and twist. I always like a good aerial photograph, and this was taken in June 2016, and it shows the cofferdam, the temporary dam sticking out into the river, and the 2 halves of the museum coming together. As the walls... So,
I have a question. I've noticed that the boat there, the famous boat, is not in water at this stage, but it actually is, I think, isn't it? Or you fill in the water around the museum after?
We filled in the water around afterwards. As part of the remit for building V&A Dundee, they actually replaced the old dock gate at Discovery Point, which was leaking, and that meant it was difficult to actually carry out work on the historic ship and preserve it. So as part of the remit to build V&A Dundee, we also replaced the dock gate, which allows them to drain the dry dock completely and do work on Discovery. And during construction, I think they took the opportunity to drain the dry dock and do some work on the ship while the museum itself was being built. We also raised and strengthened the river wall to protect the city centre against rising sea levels. So V&A Dundee is part museum, part flood defence system.
Yeah. And a part opportunity to look at this, to get in and do works on the ship there.
Exactly.
All positives, really. Yeah.
Yes. So as these walls, you could see them curving around the central cores. As they grew upwards and outwards, we had to place sensors all around the building, monitored with lasers, to check for any unexpected twisting of the walls as the weight was added. For a long time, people couldn't really see what V&A Dundee looked like because it was hidden behind this red and yellow support structure, this prop work. In a conventional building, much like the one I imagine that all of you are sitting in currently, it's the walls that hold up the roof. In V&A Dundee, it's the other way around. It's the roof that actually holds up the walls. This is basically because the walls lean out at pretty incredible angles. So until the roof went on and locked the entire building together, every single inch of the building had to be supported by this temporary prop work. This also helped keep the concrete in the right place while it dried. And we had to use a very special type of concrete, more liquid than normal, so it could pour into all the nooks and crannies of these curving bits of formwork. We could also, concrete as well gives off a lot of heat when it dries. So we had to pour the walls in a very careful sequence so we didn't accidentally put too much weight in one part of the building. It was a very complicated process.
I can imagine. It looks very complicated, let alone sounds complicated.
It took the engineers 2 whole years just to work out how the structure was going to work. These things, as I said, these projects, they take a long time in the planning, but it's important to get it right and make sure the building's strong and safe. This is just a photograph looking towards the river, and you can start to see what looks like an apex of a roof. It looks a bit like the ridge of a house coming together. There's a better photograph of it here. So this looks a bit like the apex of a roof, the ridge of a house, but in actual fact, this is the underside of the museum itself. And it creates a huge archway, a tunnel almost, underneath the museum, connecting the river and the city. So if you cast your minds back to one of the very first slides I showed you, that photograph of the historic archway designed to act as that symbolic gateway between the city and the river for Prince Albert and Queen Victoria, what we've got now is obviously a very different type of structure, but that archway connecting the city and the river is still here. Also, Kengo Kuma talks about this particular part of the building as being inspired by a torii gate, which is a Japanese shrine they place on the edge of the city that connects the city with a sacred space, usually part of the landscape. So there's historic influences from the site, but there's also Japanese influences coming in as well. There are a few hidden things in the building that people don't know about. So I thought I'd include a few little secrets, a few little surprises. First of all is this thing at the top. Kengo Kuma couldn't be on site every day, so he delegated to his second in command, who is a gentleman called Maurizio. And Maurizio is from Italy, and his older sister is a nun in Italy with the Clarice order. And before construction started, she heard that her brother Maurizio was going to be working on this project, so she gave him a blessed golden medal of the Virgin Mary to cast into the walls of the museum to give it the blessing and the protection of the Virgin Mary. So this is a photograph of Maurizio casting, just about to drop that medal into the walls, into that wooden mold before the concrete is poured on top of it. So this golden medal is buried somewhere deep in the walls of the museum where nobody will ever see it. But we like to think it is giving the building the blessing and protection of the Virgin Mary. So far, so good.
Nice touch. I like it. Hidden in there.
Definitely. We've also got a slightly more industrial thing hidden in the walls. Underneath is the photograph of the construction crews burying a time capsule in the walls of the museum as well. If you look very carefully in the photograph at the bottom left, you might be able to make out a metal cylinder, a tube being placed into this small concrete former. And this contains photographs of the museum under construction, aerial footage of the building, a fly-through of the digital structural model of the museum, and also the names of every single person who was involved in the construction process. So both of these, the time capsule and the blessed medal, we hope never to see, because that would mean something very bad had gone wrong. But it's really nice to know these things are buried permanently within the walls of the museum.
How many people are listed in that time capsule then?
If it includes all the subcontractors, we're talking thousands. The principal contractors were BAM UK, the subcontractors were Carey's PLC, who did a lot of the concrete, but then it's a question of how long's a piece of string. There'll be people involved in the electrical systems, the lighting, the services, the glazing, the plant hire, the precast. There would be a huge number of people, thousands, involved in a project of this scale.
Definitely. Wow. Guys, I just want to remind you all at this stage, just because we've got 20 minutes left. If you've got any questions, get them into the chat on the Zoom there, or if you're watching on YouTube, just pop them in the chat on there as well, and I'll read them out for Peter. So if you've got any questions, anything that sparked an interest from what we talked about so far, just let us know, and what we can read that out for you.
So I'm conscious, I think you said 20 minutes left, Lucy, didn't you? So I will crack on, because I said we've not even built the building yet. So this is a photograph of the prop work, all that support structure starting to be removed. And it had to be removed in a very careful sequence so the walls didn't twist under their own weight. This photograph shows the public entrance to the museum, but it also highlights some of the 139 little slot windows that give picture postcard views out over the landscape. Once all the scaffolding was down, people could actually see the museum's shape for the first time, although this really is V&A Dundee in its naked form. The easiest way to describe the shape of the museum is two twisting pyramids that are joined together. You can create a similar shape if you take two decks of cards, and then twist them and cut them together. So it's a very odd shape. It does mean, though, the angle of the walls means that the second floor is nearly twice the size of the ground floor. So nearly half of the second floor is actually cantilevered, suspended over thin air. It's all the more incredible because of the thinness of the walls. They're only about 250 millimeters, about a foot thick. But because of the twisting shape of these walls, a bit like origami, it actually helps give the building its strength.
Yeah, and that's the picture I was talking about earlier, where you can really see the twist in the cement there.
It's amazing curves you can get in this concrete. I've likened it to a bit like standing under the hull of a ship out of water. The concrete's actually very dark. It's got a dark pigment in it, fly ash, to make it stand out, as we'll see a little bit later on. But there's also there's no perfectly straight walls in the entire building. The reason for this is Kengo Kuma believes that straight walls, vertical walls, act a bit like a barrier, whereas subtle curves and inclinations can feel a bit more welcoming.
Beth Clark has wrote very ship-like.
Definitely. And again, it looks a bit like it in this photograph as well. This was the 1st of March 2017, the topping out ceremony, marking the completion of the highest point of the building. So the roof had gone on by this point. The topping out ceremony is marked by a tree being placed at the highest point of the museum. And this comes from an ancient Scandinavian builder's ritual of placing a tree on top of a new building to appease the tree-dwelling spirits displaced in its construction. Thankfully, we didn't have to cut down any trees to make room for V&A Dundee. In fact, we actually planted a few, but we held this small ceremony nonetheless as a bit of fun. We involved some local school children to come down to the construction site, and this is a photograph of them actually giving instructions to the crane driver to place the tree on top of the building. I hope he understood all four of them, speaking at once.
Looks like fun if you're a child, though.
Definitely. And that's one of the things we wanted to do throughout the process. We wanted to involve people in the process of creating this new museum. Over the years, V&A Dundee's formed, well, lots of people have been inspired and by the museum. We've had people being inspired, artists, photographers, game designers, even bakers. This is somebody who was inspired by the museum to bake a cake in the shape of V&A Dundee. But one of the most unusual inspirations came at this stage in the construction, when the museum's dark and forbidding appearance conjured up memories of something quite different. It inspired a local digital designer to transform the museum into a particularly famous Imperial space station from a galaxy far, far away. So I'm now going to try and share a video that was posted on YouTube that somebody had made, who was inspired by the museum to create. And it's just a bit of fun, but let's see if this works.
Yeah. Thinking about it, somebody wrote, looks like a bunker.
So thankfully that didn't happen. We didn't have the Millennium Falcon.
No, guys, if you've got the reference there, just pop that in the chat. What's important, I think, from Peter's angle is, as it's a design museum, they were open to any different interpretations of what this museum looks like, could be, through photos, through art, and this digital designer created this, which was a bit of fun and allowed a bit of promotion as well around what the museum was going to be. So it got everybody excited.
We had no idea they were going to do it, but it was a bit of fun nonetheless.
Yeah.
But the next stage was to transform the museum's appearance. It was still looking quite dark and forbidding at this point. So the next stage was to attach 2,429 huge precast panels onto the outside of the museum, the largest of which are about 4 meters long and weigh up to 3 tons each. So laid end to end, they'd actually stretch 8,787 meters, but to put that into more understandable terms, that would stretch from V&A Dundee right back to our friends at South Grange Care Home in Monifieth. So that's the second little link. So for those of you, if anyone is watching from South Grange, you could literally take all the planks off the building and they would stretch from us on the waterfront to your front door.
I'm not entirely sure if anybody from South Grange is watching today, but if you are, let us know, because there's so many references close to you right now.
They're definitely our closest Barchester home. Interestingly, during the manufacture of these precast planks, the surface was blasted with high pressure water to reveal the aggregate that contains a mix of quartzite, which is a semi-precious stone, a mineral that actually helps them sparkle in the sunshine. And it's quite a nice nod to the idea of water eroding rock, which is obviously the process behind the creation of the cliffs that inspired V&A Dundee in the first place. So these are the precast planks being attached to the museum itself. And you can see some of the huge steel brackets bolted into the channels in the concrete to hold the stone planks in place. These had to be positioned with millimeter accuracy. To give you an idea of just how accurate they had to be, the builders were working to a 2 millimeter tolerance. To put that in context, engineers at the luxury performance car manufacturer Jaguar work to a tolerance of 5 millimeters. So V&A Dundee is built to more exacting specifications than a high-performance sports car. I think that's quite impressive.
Yeah.
And once all those precast planks were on, it certainly did make V&A Dundee look quite a striking building. V&A Dundee's final appearance was revealed, and it really creates quite a dramatic play of light and shadow all around the building.
Definitely.
With the exterior complete, in September 2017, one of the last jobs was to remove that temporary dam that had surrounded and protected the building for nearly 2.5 years. You can see in this photograph a long reach excavator on the right digging away at the cofferdam, and this allowed the river to come gently up to the museum. Our attention could then turn to the interior. So we then started to fit out our learning studios, our loading bay, back of house storage areas, and things like the lift. This is the huge goods lift that takes objects up to our gallery level. And finally, in January 2018, around 34 months after construction had begun, a little under 3 years, V&A Dundee was finally finished and ready to be handed over from the contractors to ourselves. Moving in day was very exciting, but the job wasn't over then. We had to then fit out the galleries. We had to turn it from a finished building into a fully operational museum. So we had to build the cases, install the objects, get all the furniture in, a huge amount of work to get it ready for opening. Interestingly, what looks like a large metal cage in the bottom left photograph is actually the structure for one of the largest objects we have in the Scottish Design Galleries. I'll show you a photograph of that in a second. For a long time, the interior of V&A Dundee was a closely guarded secret. We didn't want to spoil the surprise, but when we opened our doors, people could come in and see what we'd been hiding. The interior is a bright, welcoming double-height entrance hall that the architect wanted to be a living room for the city, an extension of the public space outside. The flooring, the dark black flooring, is an Irish limestone embedded with fossils, about 300 million years old. Another nice nod to natural materials and the landscape.
We've got some questions coming in, so I will hold them to the end just because I know.
Sounds good. This is looking down into that main entrance hall. You might be able to see some of those 139 picture postcard windows that puncture the walls of the museum. A large sweeping staircase or a glass lift takes you up to the second floor. At the centre of the museum, we've got our permanent collection, the Scottish Design Galleries. This contains hundreds of fascinating stories about Scottish design stretching back 500 years right up to the present day. I'm deliberately not going to tell you too much about this because I believe, and Lucy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, this is going to be the subject of a future Barchester presentation with V&A Dundee. So
yes, it is.
I won't say too much about this.
Ocean liners, I think, in May.
Ocean liners we've got coming up next. And I think that's got, I think we might have a future one.
Later, yeah, we've got a few. Yeah, later in the coming months.
At the centre of that, we've got our most impressive object, I think. This is the incredible Oak Room, which was a completely restored original interior designed by one of Scotland's most famous designers, Charles Rennie Mackintosh. Charles Rennie Mackintosh was born in 1868, died in 1928. He was a Scottish architect, designer, watercolourist, and he created a number of very famous buildings across Scotland. But what's really interesting with this is Charles Rennie Mackintosh was inspired by traditional Japanese design. And when Kengo Kuma, the architect of the museum, came to Scotland, he was inspired himself by the works of Mackintosh. So it's very fitting that we've got an original piece of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who was inspired by Japan, sitting at the heart of a design museum designed by a Japanese architect who was inspired by Mackintosh. It's lots of lovely connections. We've also got the major exhibition spaces. This is the size of about 4 tennis courts, 1,100 square metres, the largest of its kind in Scotland. And this is where our major exhibitions go. Again, I won't talk too much about these because these will also be the subject of future Barchester talks. But some of the exhibitions we've had are ocean liners, speed and style. And if you're interested in this one specifically, then my colleague Charlotte Hale, one of our curators, will be speaking about this on the 18th of May. We've also had exhibitions on video games, on the future of robotics, and of course, our most recent one, Mary Quant. So many of you, I imagine, tuned in last month to hear our curator, Vary Maxwell, who actually is in that photograph, a very blurry Vary Maxwell, in Mary Quant, talking about that exhibition. As well as those spaces, we've also got a small shop in V&A Dundee. You might be able to get a better view of the flooring with all those fossils in the limestone, and an incredible restaurant, the Tatha Bar and Kitchen, Tatha being Gaelic for Tay, giving incredible views over the landscape. So this is V&A Dundee complete, costing about £80 million and over a decade since the idea had first been discussed. By September 2018, the museum was ready to open. We celebrated with a huge weekend of festivities. We had a live music performance from a number of artists, including the band Primal Scream, a firework display, a big festival over the weekend with activities for families and communities, and we even lit up our building, all these wonderful rainbow colours to show off the architecture. One of the other really special events was the day before we opened. Approximately 100 women from local community choirs came together in the museum to sing the Deacon Blue song, Dignity. And there's a video, a fantastic video on YouTube of the choir singing this song in V&A Dundee. So after this presentation, I'd encourage you, if you want to hear some fantastic music, Google V&A Dundee Dignity. And you'll be able to get that video of the choir singing in the museum.
Guys, any activity coordinators watching, we will put that link into the Life Enrichment newsletter this weekend, so you can find it and potentially share it with your residents and patients as well. I'm sure it's a really nice, heartwarming way of kind of opening the museum with a bit of song and everybody enjoying it together. It was.
Since then, since we've opened, obviously we've been working as a museum, but we've also done some rather special events. We've been a filming location for a number of big budget dramas. If anyone's watching Succession, starring Dundee's own Brian Cox, that was filmed partly in the museum, but also you can see here in the summer of 2019, we had a visit from the Antiques Roadshow. I'm not sure if it's still on iPlayer, episode 2, series 42. You might be able to find it, but this was Fiona Bruce and lots of excited members of the public outside the museum. We also had a royal visit because about 4 months after we opened our doors to the public, we had our official ceremonial opening. On the 29th of January 2019, the Duchess of Cambridge, accompanied by her husband, Prince William, officially opened V&A Dundee. and unveiled a plaque, one of these huge wooden boards that we then put into the walls of the museum. So before we finish, I just wanted to kind of sum up with a few sort of reflections on the architecture itself. I studied architecture. I find design of buildings absolutely fascinating. And there's some really interesting elements of Kengo Kuma's architecture that you can see in V&A Dundee. So I've picked out 5 key sort of elements of his architecture, and it'd be interesting to know if you can see the similarities. So first of all, Kengo Kuma is really interested in the idea of making heavy materials feel light and delicate and almost weightless. On the left, you can see a building called Chokura Plaza, built in 2006 in his native Japan, using very heavy, solid stone elements, but they touch each other very, very lightly. And you can see something similar in V&A Dundee with the precast on the facade.
Yeah.
Kengo Kuma also really likes a relationship with nature. So on the left, you can see a building called the Kitakami Canal Museum, built in 1999 in Japan. The building, you can see the photograph at the top, it blends in with the landscape. And underneath, it also helps to frame views of the river and the canal. So that also happens at V&A Dundee. Although it looks quite a striking building, it is quite modest compared to what could have been built. And the building itself frames views of the landscape. Another really interesting thing about Kengo Kuma is he likes using natural materials and traditional crafts. So on the left at the top, you can see a building called Sunny Hills, which is actually a cake shop in Japan. Looks a little bit different to the sort of cake shops we'd get, sort of pret-a-manger and, and things in the UK. But this is actually a cake shop in Japan. And lots of wood. And underneath, you've got the Kadokawa Culture Museum, which was due to open last year. So lots of wood and lots of stone used in his buildings. He tries not to use much steel and glass, which are more artificial. So again, in V&A Dundee, you can see lots and lots of wood, and you can see lots and lots of stone. The other interesting thing is the relationship with water. Water is central to Japanese architecture, and I told you how V&A Dundee sits in these 4 reflecting pools. The original concept had been for the building to sit in the river itself. When that wasn't possible, Kuma then brought the river to the building. On the left, you can see what's actually a guest house. It's not actually an office, it's a private house called Water Glass, built in 1995, and underneath is the Museum of Wisdom, both by Kengo Kuma. So again, you see that relationship with water at V&A Dundee as well. I must say the photograph at the top, both photographs actually look incredible. When the reflecting pools are still, it's like there's a stairway just descending all the way down.
Incredible. We've got some residents commenting, and thank you for everybody that's putting into the chat right now. We've got some questions that we are coming up to next. Our residents are really impressed with Tiffany with the building. Comments like it is stunning. Carolyn says, Barbara says the building is amazing and the amount of work that has gone into it is, it's highly based. Beth Parker said lovely reflections, and it's really, Japanese, when you think about Japanese kind of culture and style, it's that wood, stone and water, and you can see all of those sort of reflected in how V&A Dundee has been created, and they look absolutely stunning. You're right, the pictures there are amazing. Yeah, you've got a good quality, really good quality building there, let alone the stuff that you put inside as well.
And the last one I wanted to talk about, which is slightly more difficult to understand, but it's an element that Kengo Kuma uses in all his buildings, is the idea of human scale. So some architects like to try and trick the viewer, not maliciously, but they just like to play a few tricks, and they want to make buildings appear bigger or smaller. That's what you can do with architecture. You can play around with it. So for example, at the very top, the top left, is a building by the architectural practice Herzog and de Meuron, which is the Beijing National Stadium. It was designed in 2008 for the Olympics, and it's affectionately known as the bird's nest because it looks like it's made of these thin, delicate little bits of steel and wire. So it looks like a very delicate, small object from a distance, but actually it's huge. It can seat about 91,000 people. And when you get close to it, you realize it's not small and delicate at all. So this is an example of architects making a huge building feel or look a little bit smaller. Underneath is a building that I initially thought was a sort of odd brutalist Scottish castle. It looks, like a large and imposing building, but this is actually a building called Hermit's Castle, built by the architect David Scott in 1950. And it's really a bit of a folly, because although it looks big, it looks like it's got several windows and several floors and even a tower with a chimney. It's just big enough for one person to squeeze inside. There's only room for a very small concrete ledge on the inside that acts as a bed and a fireplace. So if you actually Google photographs of Hermit's Castle with a person standing next to it, it's really quite extraordinary. It looks like the person's a giant. So this is the opposite. This is an example of a building that is designed to look much bigger, but actually it's really small. So this is how architecture can play tricks on you. But Kengo Kuma doesn't do that. Kengo Kuma wants to be truthful in his architecture. And the way he does that is by using lots and lots of smaller, understandable sized pieces. He calls it particle architecture, the idea of breaking up something really big into sort of bite-sized chunks. The idea is that you can stand or sit next to one of these wooden panels. It's the same with the system on the outside of the building, and understand how big you are in relation to it. And that's repeated across the size of the building. And this can be seen in V&A Dundee, but it can also be seen in his largest building. So I'm just going to jump back to the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Stadium. Although this is an absolutely huge building, Kengo Kuma deliberately designed it so it's made up of the smallest timber elements possible. If you look very carefully, you can see lots and lots of tiny bits of timber. Even the balconies are covered in these little thin strips of timber. So it's to try and make this huge building feel a bit more human, a bit more relatable. So hopefully we'll see a bit more of the National Stadium this year as part of the Tokyo Olympics.
Yeah, and anybody watching that will watch the Olympics later this year can say, oh, I know about, Kengo's work at V&A Dundee, and kind of look at the architecture and the design of the building versus what the V&A Dundee has, and how relatable those pieces are. I'm going to have to, how long have we got left, Peter? Because we've
just got the last slide. So it was just to say, to finish, we're going to just come back to Dundee, and the museum's already become part of the buildings, the city's landscape. You can see the building sitting there. We're incredibly fortunate to be able to work in such a gorgeous building, in such a gorgeous location. These are some of the sunrises, sunsets, the views that we have from the building. And I'm sure you can agree that it does look absolutely beautiful. Lastly, we're just really excited to look towards the future with this incredible modern building, this incredible modern museum, and welcome visitors to V&A Dundee once again. So that sort of takes us on a journey from the very earliest beginnings, even before that, Dundee's history, the waterfront, and the whole story of V&A Dundee, from design, construction, to completion. And I hope it's been interesting, and I'd love to hear if there's any questions.
Absolutely. So guys, if you haven't already, get them in. I know that we had a question about what was in the building, and I think we went through that, but you might want to just recap on the exhibitions that you have, Peter.
Definitely. So V&A Dundee is a design museum. So we're not an art gallery. We don't have oil paintings and sculptures. Dundee's already got a fantastic museum and art gallery called McManus, which is interestingly the old Albert Institute. So there is another connection with Victoria and Albert there. So V&A Dundee is a design museum. We're the only design museum in Scotland. We're the first design museum in the UK outside London. So we focus on architecture, engineering, fashion, textiles, gaming, graphic design, lots of different disciplines, but it's slightly different to an art gallery or a sort of a historic museum that focuses on sculpture or paintings. Yeah. As well as that, we've also got the major exhibition galleries, and this is where we house our temporary exhibitions, the changing exhibitions. So things like Mary Quant, which we had last year, which again, many of you probably came along to the presentation from my colleague Vari. That exhibition was at V&A Dundee for about 4 months, and then it moves on. It's actually gone to Australia. And we've had lots of these exhibitions. they're very different. We've had ocean liners, video games, robots, Mary Quant, and the next one that we're opening with on the 1st of May is all about nightclubs, 5 decades of nightclub culture and design, which again, I think, we'll be working with Lucy and the team to see if we can bring that to you as well. So there's a lot of stuff inside the museum, very different.
Culture over the last 50 years. Fascinated. I can't wait to hear that one. A question from Westwood House. Who paid for the building?
So the building was funded by a number of different organisations. It was actually in part funded by the largest cultural campaign of its kind in Scotland. We raised £15 million from private sources, so generous individuals, trusts and foundations donating their own money to build V&A Dundee. We got support from Creative Scotland, Heritage Lottery Fund, People's Postcode Lottery, Scottish Government, National Government, and Dundee City Council. So it was a real team effort to fundraise for the whole project.
Yeah. We're getting loads of lovely comments that people really want to come visit. They've loved the detail. It's very interesting and informative. Beaumont, thank you from Rivermead. Crabble Hall, thank you, Peter. It's really interesting. Any more questions? I don't see any more. But just a reminder, when did the design start through to construction, through to opening, and that whole period?
So that timeline. So we had the architectural competition was it was in the autumn of 2010. Kenga Kuma was appointed in November 2010. They had the first meeting of the design team in early 2012. And then from 2012 all the way through to 2015, that was the design process. That was going back to the architects, working out, can we do this, can we do that, tweaking the design. You might notice that the very early submission to the competition does look slightly different, but that's just because that's the design process. Things would have to change slightly. Then we started construction on March 2015, and that ran for about nearly 3 years, but that ran until January 2018. And that's when the building was completed. It was handed over from the contractors to ourselves. And then from January to September 2018, we had to fit out the museum and get it ready for visitors. And then on the 15th of September 2018, we officially opened our doors to the public.
And then Kate and William came in the year after?
They came just in January, end of January 2019. So that's quite normal for big public buildings. And we have the public opening, we get a few months of operation under our belts. And then once things have settled down a little bit, we then have a royal opening or an official opening, because trying to factor in royalty into the amount of hype and pressure when we were actually opening to the public, it would just be too much. So we need to space things out a bit and keep the excitement going.
Definitely. Just loads of comments saying that it was really enjoyable. So everybody that wants to watch the choir singing for the opening, we will provide the link in the newsletter this weekend, and any other tidbits of information that we haven't fitted in here and it is available online, we will provide you with the links for all of that. I don't think we've got any more questions, but Peter, this has been amazing. It's been a really, really interesting talk, and thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come and provide this for us.
You're most welcome.
We're getting really good comments. Anybody that's an activity coordinator or staff member that's watching right now, so the newsletter that comes out of the weekend, check the links, everything I've just said, but also in the next couple of weeks, I will be providing a Survey Monkey for you via email link. And I would like your say and review of the virtual events that we've had so far, and any suggestions for future upcoming ones. So that will be for you and your residents to fill out. I just want to say thanks to everybody that's writing in the chat right now. Wadhurst, Dawn, Maxine, I know Ford Mill wrote something as well. Thank you so much for the feedback. We will be using that. But feel free to email Life Enrichment with any feedback as well. We like to share this with all people like Peter, so that they know what they're getting and how your residents have enjoyed it. Because it's always good to feed back to people that are providing their time for you like this. So we want to share the goodness. So thank you so much for watching. All those that are watching on YouTube, thank you for joining. And all those watching on Zoom, thank you. I hope you had a good session and it was informative and fun, and we've given you some sort of incentive to now want to visit V&A Dundee, if not physically, virtually again at some point. So thank you so much. Peter, any final comments from you?
No, just again, thank you all very much for tuning in wherever you are. I hope you're staying safe and well. And again, if anyone is interested in visiting V&A Dundee, then as I said, we're reopening on the 1st of May. I know travel restrictions might make things a bit tricky, but if any activity coordinators or members of staff do want to get in touch with me directly, I think, Lucy, you said you'd kindly share my contact details. One of the roles that I have at the museum is around coordinating visits from care homes all across the country. So again, hopefully when travel restrictions ease a little bit, for anyone who is interested in visiting us in person, then we'd be delighted to have you, and I'd love to chat to you further about that. So hopefully we'll meet again in the future.
Thank you, Peter. I was going to say, for those that are far away that won't be able to do the travel, we can look at setting up something personal for your home, and maybe you're an individual resident as well at some point in the future.
We've done in the past, we've done live digital tours from the museum. So rather than a presentation like this with me sitting in my living room, it'll be me in the exhibition, in the museum, walking around and chatting to a home directly. So there's lots of things that we can do if people are interested.
Brilliant. We'll provide Peter's contact details, but feel free to email Life Enrichment as well. Lucy Perkins and myself will be looking at that inbox and helping you out as best as we can. So that's everything for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for all the comments. Feel free to give us any more feedback in the email there for lifeenrichment@barchester.com, and watch out for the Survey Monkey coming in a couple of weeks. And that will be all for today. So I'm going to stop the live stream now, and I'm going to end the call. But thank you so much, guys, and take care.